This is a bonus episode of History as It Happens. It's Thursday, November 20th. It was an appalling scene inside the Oval Office. President Trump fawning over one of the most repressive autocrats in the world, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. According to Freedom House, Saudi Arabia's absolute monarchy restricts almost all political rights and civil liberties. No officials at the national level are elected. The regime relies on pervasive surveillance, the criminalization of dissent, appeals to sectarianism and ethnicity, and public spending supported by oil revenues to maintain power. The New York Times reports the number of executions in Saudi Arabia has soared as officials use the death penalty against drug smugglers who ferry hashish and amphetamine pills into the kingdom. At least 320 executions so far this year. In the United States, MBS, as he's often referred to, is best known for his role in the murder of dissident journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Here are Trump and the Crown Prince being asked about the murder in the Oval Office the other day.
Royal Highness, the U.S. intelligence concluded that you orchestrated the brutal murder of a journalist. 9/11 families are furious that you are here in the Oval Office. Why should Americans trust you? And the same to you, Mr. President.
Now, who are you with?
I'm with ABC News, sir.
You're with who?
ABC News, sir.
Fake news. ABC fake news. One of the worst in the business. But I'll answer your question. As far as this gentleman is concerned, he's done a phenomenal job. You're mentioning somebody that was extremely controversial. A lot of people didn't like that gentleman that you're talking about. Whether you like him or didn't like him, things happen. But he knew nothing about it, and we can leave it at that. You don't have to embarrass our guest by asking a question like that.
It's okay, just you ask, Mr. President, you allow me to answer. You know, I feel painful about, the families of 9/11 in America, but, we have to focus on reality. Reality based on CIA documents and based on a lot of documents that Osama bin Laden, he used Saudi people in that event for one main purpose, is to destroy this relation. To destroy the American-Saudi relation. That's the purpose of 9/11. So whoever buying that means they are helping Osama bin Laden's purpose of destroying this relation. He knows that strong relation between America and Saudi Arabia, it's bad for extremism, it's bad for terrorism. And we have to approve him wrong and to build our relation, continue developing our relation. It's critical in the safety of the world. It's critical against extremism and terrorism. About the journalists, it's really painful to hear, anyone that been losing his life for, no real purpose or not in a legal way, and it's been painful for us in Saudi Arabia. We've did all the right steps of investigation, etc., in Saudi Arabia, and we've improved our system to be sure that nothing happened like that, and it's painful and it's a huge mistake, and we are doing our best that this doesn't happen again.
Offering a state visit to the Saudi autocrat may not have been necessary, but the reality is if the U.S. wants to maintain working relations with that country, it does have to deal with its ruler. So what happened this week in Washington? At CNN.com, Abbas al-Lawati and Becky Anderson write, Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince got almost everything he wanted from Donald Trump. Perhaps his biggest win was persuading Trump to drop the one condition Washington had long insisted on before sealing major defense and trade deals with Riyadh: full normalization with Israel. But with that condition dropped, they say, the U.S. has now designated Saudi Arabia a major non-NATO ally, is moving forward with plans to sell it F-35 jets, and signed a new strategic defense agreement whose details are unclear. The two countries also launched an AI cooperation framework, which includes clearing the sale of advanced chips to the kingdom, signed a critical minerals agreement, and opened the door to expand cooperation on nuclear energy. But there was no formal defense commitment, and our guest in this episode says such a commitment would be a major mistake. Trita Parsi is the executive vice president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He is an expert on U.S.-Iranian relations, Iranian foreign policy, and the geopolitics of the Middle East. Trita Parsi, it is great to have you back. Welcome.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me again.
So before we get to the visit between President Trump and Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, let's just go back in time just a little bit. When Donald Trump returned to the White House in January, after 4 years of the Biden administration, what state were U.S.-Saudi relations in?
So Saudi-U.S. relations were still in a rather tense state. The Biden administration came into office and spoke very aggressively, and in my view, quite justifiably against Saudi Arabia. In February in 2021, Biden said that this war must end, and talking about the war that Saudi Arabia had started against the Houthis and then was just bombing Yemen to smithers. The US was originally in on it, but there was a lot of political pressure to end that war.
We're also stepping up our diplomacy to end the war in Yemen, a war which has created a humanitarian and strategic catastrophe. I've asked my Middle East team to ensure our support for the United Nations-led initiative to impose a ceasefire, open humanitarian challenge, and restore long dormant peace talks. This war has to end.
And during the campaign, Biden had also called Saudi Arabia a pariah state and said that we should treat it as the pariah that it is. And to be frank with you, back then, that was actually a very accurate statement.
Khashoggi was, in fact, murdered and dismembered, and I believe in the order of the Crown Prince. And I would make it very clear, we were not going to, in fact, sell more weapons to them. We were going to, in fact, make them pay the price and make them, in fact, the pariah that they are. There's very little social redeeming value in the present government in Saudi Arabia.
MBS had killed Jamal Khashoggi. He had kidnapped the prime minister of Lebanon. He had started that campaign, that blockade against Qatar, probably was thinking of invading the country, but was stopped because the Turks sent troops to Qatar. And of course, Yemen. So, this was a crown prince that came in with a tremendously reckless foreign policy. But it didn't take long for the Biden administration to just completely shift, even though they didn't want to do a public embrace of MBS. They kind of still wanted to treat him at an arm's distance. Jake Sullivan was going to Saudi Arabia, but refused to have a photo op with MBS, which insulted MBS. And MBS, as a result, decided to be, I think, an hour or 2 hours late for the meeting. And then he showed up in t-shirt and shorts, saying, well, if you're not going to take pictures, then I'm not going to treat this as if this is really a professional visit. So
who's the client here, right?
Yeah, exactly. So there was a lot of personal animosity, but on substance, it's important to understand the Biden administration was considering offering the Saudis, and may have actually offered the Saudis, a full defense pact, meaning a NATO-level Article 5 defense pact with the Saudis as part of a larger deal with Israel and normalization. They had offered nuclear collaboration to the point that it not only would violate the 123 agreement that the US has pursued, which is like the gold standard, but also concerns on the American side that the Saudis would gain access to nuclear technology that would enable them to build nuclear weapons down the road. And as a result, was considering having US troops guard the nuclear facilities in Saudi Arabia against Saudis. Now, if you're considering doing that, perhaps that is a bit of a red flag that your idea of offering this type of nuclear collaboration is a pretty bad one in the first place. They also had considerations for having self-destruction capabilities in those facilities so that the US could remotely blow up the entire nuclear facility. So the Biden administration was actually offering all of the goodies to Saudi Arabia, because if there was one thing that was guiding Biden's foreign policy in the Middle East, was to get the Saudis into the Abraham Accord and normalize with Israel. Part of the reason why at the end of the day this really didn't happen is because of October 7th and because the Israelis kind of lost interest and were much more inclined to go down the path of genocide than the path of normalization with Saudi Arabia. So even though you didn't have the red carpet, even though you didn't have Biden tell an American journalist, how dare you ask that question and insult our guests when you're asking them about Jamal Khashoggi, or even suggest that, Khashoggi was a disliked figure or a controversial figure, yeah, he didn't do any of those things. But on substance, the Biden administration appeared to have been ready to offer more in terms of defense obligations to the Saudis than what the Trump administration appears to be doing. We don't know quite yet exactly what the deal is.
Yes, they did say in that Oval Office meeting, actually President Trump said it, that they agreed to some kind of defense agreement, but no details were forthcoming.
And the defense agreement, have you reached agreement on that? We pretty much have.
Quick question for the Crown Prince, if I could just finish.
We have reached agreement on that. Okay.
But as you said, when Joe Biden was a candidate in 2020, it was easier to say, Saudi Arabia, pariah state, we're going to cut off weapons to Saudi Arabia so it can't keep brutalizing Yemen. He did the fist bump. He didn't shake his hand when he finally got into office, Biden, referring to Biden here. He did the famous fist bump when he met Mohammed bin Salman, because the reality is, Trita, and obviously as a realist, you know this, everyone knows this, the United States has to deal with some unsavory characters in the world. It was still shocking, though, because going back to his most recent visit to Washington, Mohammed bin Salman, in 2018, a New York Times op-ed says his brief tenure, and this again in 2018, was known in the U.S. principally for his authoritarianism and foreign adventurism. You mentioned some of those as well. The resignation of Lebanon's prime minister is actually kidnapped, as you said, the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. But once you're in office, right, it's a very difficult balancing act.
Of course, at the end of the day, it is. And I think here, the Trump administration approaches this in a manner in which these kind of dimensions don't even exist. I mean, the Trump administration does not pretend to be a beacon of human rights. And I think a lot of folks rightfully are upset about a lot of the things that is clear violations of human rights. They're upset that there isn't a desire to uphold human rights. And I sympathize with that. But I'm a little bit jaded right now because they would be happy with the Biden administration pretending to uphold human rights while facilitating a genocide. So in some ways, I much rather have an administration that is not facilitating genocide. In this case, I'm not really saying that Trump isn't, because Trump has also allowed the Israelis to do even more than what Biden did. But getting rid of this pretense that so often is just false may be helpful. Not in order to stay at that level, not in order for us to forever not care about that issue, but as a first necessary step towards rebuilding a more credible approach towards human rights.
Yes.
That is not suffering from this blatant double standard and hollowness, as it has been for quite some time, but particularly in the last couple of years, in which the Biden administration said that human rights is at the center of their foreign policy, and then they're helping make sure that a genocide can just go on and on and on.
Yeah, because what you're saying here raises the most important question, is that what does the U.S. need from Saudi Arabia and why, and vice versa? What does Saudi Arabia need from the U.S.? You were referring to the genocide. I agree. The Biden and Trump administrations, in violation of U.S. law and international law, continued to supply Israel with all the weapons it wanted to pulverize Gaza into dust. So the Saudis and the U.S., we had the visit. Let's start with the U.S. perspective. Why does the United States continue to need Saudi Arabia? If you go to Freedom House's website, Freedom House says Saudi Arabia is basically at the bottom of the rankings for political freedom and civil liberties. They essentially do not exist in Saudi Arabia, even when taking into consideration some of the more recent reforms to, say, give women a degree of autonomy in that country. So when you set all of that aside, there's this idea that there's a new Middle East, right? And Saudi Arabia is an integral part of that when it comes to, say, Abraham Accords, the Palestinians, dealing with Iran. We'll start with the U.S. and the Trump administration's perspective. Why do they need the Saudis?
So let's first clarify a couple of things.
Sure.
Saudi Arabia is an important country. It is the home of the holiest sites of the religion of Islam. It is an extremely wealthy country with its oil reserves, not much gas reserves, but nevertheless is the biggest player in OPEC. So undoubtedly a big player. None of that, however, in and of itself justifies the United States offering a defense pact for Saudi Arabia. The fact that Saudi's foreign policy has become much more moderate and stability-centric than it was 5 years ago is also great. That's fantastic. Glad. We should encourage it further. Also does not justify a defense pact. A defense pact is justified when it offers the United States, on balance, pretty much the same thing that it offers the other country. It has to be a two-way street. There is nothing in terms of defense that the Saudis offers the U.S. We don't need to have bases there for our interests in the region. Frankly, we don't need to have any bases in the Middle East at all. So I think we have to separate the idea of, hey, is Saudi Arabia an important country? Does it play an important role? Yes, it does. None of that, however, justifies a defense pact. And a lot of people in Washington are conflating the two. Because Saudi Arabia is an important country, because it's emerging as a very influential middle power, that in and of itself automatically means that we have to have offering them some sort of a security umbrella. And it just goes back to the thinking within the primicists, which is that we just have to constantly grow this network of alliances, this alliance system, as if that is fundamentally the most important thing for global stability and US security. It is that alliance system has got us offering security guarantees and weapons to all three sides in various conflicts. And that in of itself tells us that, perhaps we have overextended ourselves a little bit.
Sure.
When we look more specifically of why Saudi still is important, despite the fact we don't need their oil, we don't buy their oil, China buys their oil, why are we subsidizing China's oil imports? Well, Saudi Arabia still has a tremendous amount of financial weight, a country that can play a critical role in the investment of AI, and there is an AI race, of course. There is a fear that if the Saudis go too close to the Chinese, that will be a negative for the United States. In some aspects, I'm sure it will. But we can't play it the way we played it before, which is to say, you're going to be on our team and you can't do anything with the Chinese because the Saudis are too smart and too powerful to play that game at this point. They are really taking advantage of their middle power status in which they're playing various sides against each other for their own interest. Turkey is another country that's quite successfully has been able to do that. The fastest route for us to push them away from us is to tell them it's only us, no one else. That will cause them to reject us, I think.
Yeah, so it's not entirely clear to me why the Trump administration wanted this meeting and what they hope to get out of it.
Getting a lot of investments into the United States is something that Trump himself seems to be quite focused on.
Yeah, they threw a lot around a number like $1 trillion, but I mean, these numbers are fictitious.
Yeah. Will they ever make that investment? Will the U.S. ever deliver the F-35s? The U.S. promised F-35s to the UAE as part of the Abraham Accord and still has not delivered them. It will take 8 to 10 years to deliver them to Saudi Arabia. A lot can happen in those years. So there's a lot of this that seems to just be a lot of fluff. We don't know for certain exactly. The one area that seems to be a little bit more concrete and could be very, very dangerous is if the United States offers the Saudis.
To listen to this entire episode, tap subscribe now in the show notes or go to historyasithappens.supercast.com. For $5 a month, you get ad-free listening, bonus content, and access to the entire catalog of 500 episodes. historyasithappens.supercast.com.